So I got the feeling that many preachers think their congregation wants simple preaching, simple sermons. And I think especially yesterday seemed for many a bit complicated. So I thought my question is how to preach biblical theology and how to react to a congregation who wants simple sermons. Maybe Dr. Hamilton.
So I preach expositionally, book through book, book by book, and a lot of the time it's just verse by verse exposition. In those sermons, however, there will usually be a point at which I will try to situate what we're looking at in this particular passage in the context of the big story. There are occasions, like for instance, when I've just preached Exodus 25 through 31, and these are the instructions of the tabernacle, and I did not go verse by verse through some of the section about like the frames of the tabernacle and the curtains of the tabernacle. I tried to point to features of the text and then communicate the broader biblical theological significance of that text. So, I'm doing my best here trying to preach biblical theology and trying to do it in a faithful way that exposits the text. On the matter of whether or not it's complicated, I have been profoundly blessed by one of my co-pastors who has, I think, helped our congregation to be thankful for what they have and not to grumble about what they don't have. And what I mean is that he will regularly, publicly communicate his gratitude to God that I'm the preacher at the church. And that is humbling and encouraging to me. And I think it also, in really helpful ways, communicates, I'm not Rick Warren, I'm not Winston Churchill, I'm not, there's a famous preacher in Louisville, he's so famous I can't call his name, Kyle Idleman. He's one of these inspirational guys, okay? That's not who I am. And I think that my fellow pastor is useful in saying to our congregation, let's be grateful for what we have. And so, I think a lot of that has to do with attitude, and a mature Christian is easily edified. And there is always something that we could complain about. There is always something that we could point out to be lacking in the preaching that we've just heard. There's always something that we could point to and say, well, it wasn't very emotionally stirring, or it wasn't very applicational, or it was really complicated, there's always something that you can complain about. And so I think that we want to model and encourage gratitude and godliness in the way that we respond to preachers. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that is, if by simple we mean shallow, then I think we can reject that, right? But if by simple we mean clear and understandable, I think we ought to aim for that. So I think we can be simple, but not shallow. One of the things that Mark Dever used to say was, I assume that all my people are really intelligent and know nothing. So there's a way that I can explain this and they can understand it, even though they might not know anything about this deep theology. And I want to work hard to not be shallow, to get these deep, rich truths. But in such a way that somebody who's hearing this for the first time can follow and understand. And that takes a lot of work. It's like read the Jesus Storybook Bible or what's Helm's one?
Big Picture Story Bible.
Big Picture Storybook Bible. Those are great, helps to get some of these things down at a kid level and to try and do that with some of these other things. is a good thing to work to do, but it takes work. I don't know. So I don't really have an answer other than to say I think we ought to aim for being clearly understood, but not shallow. Yeah.
Okay, next question here.
Oh, brothers, thank you for your teaching. My question is more for Mario. And when we look to the ancient Near Eastern background, including Second Temple literature, Septuagint, in regard to the chaos camp or cosmic war motif, there is a lot of information about what some theologians call the divine council worldview. My question is, how much do we miss, or how much it can inform us to know about the literature when we want to understand the biblical theology of the divine council? And for example, to interpret the book of Revelation or Daniel, where we find so much spiritual warfare or divine council motif.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Maybe to say one thing before I try to answer the question. So I believe in the clarity of Scripture for all believers. By that I mean that everything that we need to know for godliness is revealed and clear in the Scriptures, if you have the ancient Eastern context or not. The Scriptures are sufficient for us to equip us for godliness. I think that's an important point to make, because people can get the impression that when specialists talk about all these background stuff, that you need a degree and some specialized sort of study to understand the Bible in the right way. I don't think that's accurate. I do think everything we need for godliness is plain to every reader of the Bible. That's my first thing I would say about this. The second thing that I would say about this is also that I personally use the ancient Eastern background as a sort of amplifying heuristic model. So for instance, what I presented this morning with the Chaos Kampf motif throughout the Scriptures, I think you can see that even without the ancient Eastern evidence. I think it's possible to see that, and we heard some in the sermon just now with the conflict motif, right? That's very evident for every reader of Scripture, that there is a cosmic conflict in the Bible, even if you do not have the ancient Eastern evidence. But I think it makes it easier. It amplifies what is already there for us. It gives us a lens to look at this and see things maybe more clearly, because we can get to the worldview of the authors of Scripture. Now, with that being said, I do think the divine counsel motif is not necessarily related to the Chaos Kampf motif. And there's a lot of debate. I mean, Michael Heiser has written this influential book about the divine counsel motif and about the spiritual world. I have some questions with regard to this book. For instance, I would interpret Psalm 82, which is often the divine counsel text, right? Yahweh sits in the assembly of the gods. I'm very much fond of the interpretation that this is sort of a poetic deconstruction of polytheism. What I mean by this is the psalm starts with God sitting in the council of the gods, but when you read to the very end, they shall die like man. Right? What they thought about to be gods are not. The psalm unmasks them in a narrative progress. So divine counsel might be an instance of accommodation, as I said this morning, but I'm not too sure about it. I do think I have a hard time with the divine counsel. I don't think it's as clear of an image in the Scriptures as the Chaos Kampf motif is, because that really unfolds progressively throughout the entire canon, if that answers your question.
I was thinking, like, for example, the book of Enoch, and
Yes.
how is using the New Testament, how much that literature that is from the Second Temple inform us in order to interpret, like, Genesis 6, where First Enoch talks about what in Genesis 6 happened.
You're talking about the Nephilim and that they become like fallen watchmen in the book of Enoch and these types of things. Yeah. Second Temple literature. I'm a bit more pessimistic. That's very far removed diachronically from Genesis 6. So Genesis 6 is written 1200 BC, and the Second Temple literature it's a long process of interpretation that has already happened. I'm a bit more pessimistic about those readings. I think Book of Enoch is more helpful to read the New Testament.
Well, I don't want to interrupt, but I think we need to move on. Otherwise, I said one question and then I just give you 3 times 1 question. Is there a lady who wants to ask something? Last time I went home and I thought, I totally forgot the ladies. That's not a good thing. Yeah? Oh.
I have a question for Mario. You mentioned that modern commentaries are full of references to Greco-Roman world and ancient Near Eastern world. How do you know when there is a real link between those worlds and the Bible, and when it's something in the commentary just too far-fetched?
Oh, when there's a real link. Is that what you said? When there's a real link between the Bible and those worlds? Oh, okay. Yeah, how do you know?
Sounds like a good question.
So there's the person I studied under for my PhD. He has kind of these 4 guidelines that he always proposed that we should look at. He calls them the measurements of propinquity. Propinquity means nearness. And he says you should look at 4 things. The first is there temporal propinquity? So that means, is those texts that the authors reference from the Greco-Roman or the ancient Eastern world, are they somewhat from the same time period that the biblical text was written, right? Second thing is a geographical propinquity. Are those from the same area? So you couldn't compare, I don't know, Genesis 12 to a text that was written somewhere in the Pacific Ocean at the same time period, right? It's just too far away. It's very unlikely that there's any influence. Is there cultural propinquity? So is the culture somewhat related to Israel's culture? And then the most important one, do the contexts of both passages amplify each other? Like, is there really this moment of amplification? Does it really help to read the Bible? Does it really make sense? Like, does it really open up something? And you will feel that when you read this. You're like, oh, okay, now I understand. If it doesn't do that, it's very likely not related.
Also a question for Mario. You talked about the importance of knowledge of the world and background of the Bible. I'm interested, what's your opinion, what it means for the doctrine of creation? I read some books by John Walton. You know, he has a specific theory about creation and Mid-Eastern literature. Can you say something about it?
Yeah, sure. Is your question specifically with regard to Walton's hypothesis about Genesis 1?
More generally, what does the background of the biblical world means for our view on creation, and specifically John Walton?
Yeah. Maybe you can say something about that too. So I think if you read Genesis 1 and you go and read a text like, I don't know, Adram Hasis, which is a Babylonian creation myth, or you go and read a text like Enuma Elish, which is also a Babylonian creation myth, you will find a lot of parallels. That's undeniable. If we say they're not there, we're lying. We need to be honest about what is there. So these parallels exist, and I do think that Walton is right in that he emphasizes the fact that Genesis 1 uses the same language as those texts. The language is very similar. I think we cannot deny that. If we deny that, then we become untruthful in our language, and I wouldn't want to do that. At the same time, I would say that Genesis 1 is fundamentally different from those texts, very much so. For instance, one of the things that Walton is very adamant about is that distinction between functional and material creation. He says Genesis 1 is only about functionality, it is not about materiality. I don't think that holds for the ancient Eastern accounts, and I don't think it holds for Genesis 1. In Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we see how the material world comes into existence and how it starts to function, right? The issue is how will it's a garden that's planted, right? It's the origin of the species that we see there. I do think he's a bit off there. So I'm very fond of this idea of accommodation again in this sense. That I think Genesis 1 really accommodates creation from nothing to an ancient Near Eastern worldview. So I would not be ashamed to say that Genesis 1 teaches a creation from nothing very clearly. Maybe you want to say something?
I agree with everything you just said.
Okay.
I like it.
Somebody from here?
Yeah, I have a question about accommodation theory. Once I wrote a paper about God's immutability, and some people say, like Calvin, that this is also a way of God adjusting his message, of revealing himself in terms of that we can understand it. So my question is, where's the division line between accommodation and some real knowledge? I don't know if you get my question. So, can we really know things about God if he is adjusting his... to apply this to creation, for example, we can also say, this is God accommodating that message in terms of words or knowledge of that time. How can I divide between accommodation and real knowledge?
You're asking the question of my life. That's I was on the train with Matthias here, and I told him if I had to put all my scholarly stuff that I do down to one question, it would be the question of how is it that God speaks to us so that we can understand him? Like, this really is the question of my life, right? How is that possible? And accommodation plays a huge role in this, and I'm thankful for the question. So the way I typically tell it to my students is, we already make the first mistake when we think that we could look beyond accommodation to sort of an eternal knowledge of God. It's impossible for us. We can never bridge the gap completely. It's never possible for us to take God's perspective on the world. We cannot. We cannot fully embrace God's perspective on the world because we are finite creatures. And I think we all have this idea that, and it's really big in ethical theory today, like go and read about modern attempts to justify all kinds of sexual immoralities. Right? What they will end up arguing is, the way the scriptures speak only applies to the first century, doesn't apply to us today, right? So they make this distinction, there's some eternal knowledge, and then there's some accommodated knowledge, and that accommodated knowledge has nothing to do with us, right? We have now these eternal truths, and within that realm, God does not condemn any some certain kinds of sexual immoralities. It's a very common argument made in ethics today. I don't think that holds. I think there's a huge problem because it assumes that we could take the perspective of God. It very much assumes that. That's the first big problem. The second big problem, I think, is, and that's what I always tell my students, I speak about it in terms of, I call it providential anthropomorphism. What do I mean by that? Providential anthropomorphism. One of your Dutch theologians, Herman Bavinck, he has a beautiful section on accommodation and anthropomorphism in his second volume of his Reformed Dogmatics, where he kind of says, God has names, right? He reveals himself to us with certain names. He's love. He is El Shaddai. He has all these names with which he reveals himself to us. And Bavinck says, so are these names just arbitrary? But are they just arbitrary? Are they just are they just the accident of time? Because that's just how people envision God at those very periods of time. He says, no, they're not. They reveal truths about God because this is how God chooses to portray himself to us. Because God is the one who accommodates himself, right? We're not accommodating God, but God accommodates himself to us. And I would hold that God, in his providence, and I think the doctrine of providence is very uncontroversial among Christians, has guided the beliefs and the history of the world in such a way as to bring his own self-revelation in just such a time that it would accurately reflect, even though it is accommodated, it would accurately reflect who he is for his people. So I don't think we need to go both either way. We can say it is accommodated and it is accurate knowledge of who God is. That's what I would hold. Yeah.
Thank you. Here in the middle, you were first, I think.
I have a question about the Psalms teaching that we had in the morning. Would you and it's very could be a yes and no answer, but would you suggest to read the Psalms without chapter divisions, or do you think that they are useful there?
Well, I think that there are natural literary units that reflect the chapters, and so I would want people to read the literary structure, let's say, of Psalm 9, and even though Psalm 10 doesn't have a superscription, many psalms will have superscriptions that will mark the beginning point of the psalm. Psalm 10 doesn't have a superscription, and some scholars conclude that Psalms 9 and 10 were originally one, in part because the LXX joins them. The Greek translation joins Psalm 9 and 10 together. I actually think that that's wrong, and I think that Psalm 10 has a very different theme than Psalm 9 has, and that each of them is a self-contained literary unit unto itself. So I think it's useful to look at the Psalms as individual psalms, but in the context of the Psalter. So I think we want to do both. We want to study this psalm closely for its own statement and its own structure, but also read it especially with its immediate neighbors, but also with the entirety of the Psalter.
Okay, thank you. I feel as to ask this question as well as not to ask, but I think the urge to ask is more stronger. We are talking about biblical theology. What is really the essence? Is biblical theology under threat by other theologies? Or
Could you restate that? Sorry, could you say that again? Is biblical theology?
Yeah, what is really the essence of us engaging in this type of theology titled biblical theology? Is it under threat from other theologies? And does the Bible itself inform us of any threats, if at all they are, specifically in relation to preaching, the preacher, and what is preached?
Is it under threat? Under threat from other theologies? That's what you said, right? Under threat.
Yeah, threat.
Okay.
Is it threatened by other theologies, or what is it? What are we trying to defend in biblical theology?
So there are different ways of answering that question. The book that you received earlier by Gerhardus Voss advocates the idea that you have exegesis, and then after you do your exegesis, then you put that in the context of the canon and you do biblical theology, and then after you've done biblical theology, you do systematic theology. And this would be a sort of step-by-step process, and that view has led many people to speak of biblical theology as a bridge discipline that bridges between your exegesis and your systematic theologizing. I don't prefer that way of thinking about it. I think that there are different tools for different jobs. So I think it's better to think, so this is just my personal preference, and some people will agree with me, some people won't. If you take Voss's view, that's fine. I mean, who's monitoring these things? Nobody's giving you a grade for this, at least not that I know of. I guess your grade is the evaluation of your life, So I think it's better to think of these approaches as different tools for different questions that arise as we deal with life. So there are going to be occasions when we are confronted with a very systematic theological question. Is God a Trinity? Does Christ have two natures? And when we're confronted with a systematic theological question, I think we need to give a systematic theological answer. We're going to be confronted with ethical questions, and then we need to apply ethical reasoning. And then there are going to be times when we need to put a text into its sort of ideological context, and we need to understand the ideology, the worldview, the perspective that the authors of the texts are assuming as they write, and that is when we're, I think, trying to do biblical theology. So I think biblical theology should inform exegesis. I don't think it's a first you do exegesis, then you do biblical theology, because in many cases, I think if you haven't done biblical theology and then you go do exegesis, you're going to come up with narrow and potentially mistaken answers to the questions you're asking about the text. So,
yeah, I think the other problem with the bridge idea too is that systematic, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like systematic theology and biblical theology speak to one another or almost feed one another like a loop. So our doctrine of the Word of God is a systematic that actually informs the way we read the Bible, allowing us to do biblical theology. But as we do biblical theology, we're gonna develop systematic ideas about God, which then inform us. So just to comment on the bridge idea seems problematic, and for that reason too, it's hard to distinguish.
yeah.
They're certainly not opposed to one another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here to the left. 2, next to you.
Yeah, I have a question for Jim. So you talked about the curse that the woman receives and about how her husband will rule over her. Some people will argue that, when Paul speaks of men and women in the church, they'll argue that because the curse was after the fall, that now in the new covenant, there are no distinction in gender roles anymore. That was something after the fall. Now everyone has the same role in the church because we're restored to our original place. Could you speak to that issue?
Sure. I think that the problem with those kinds of arguments is that the grounding that Paul gives in both 1 Timothy 2 and in 1 Corinthians 11 it appeals to the pre-fall created order. So for instance, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, for the man was not created for the woman, but the woman for the man. And he's appealing to this gender hierarchy, and he's basing it in the fact that the Lord said, I will make a helper fit for him. And that's obviously in Genesis 2, prior to the entrance of sin. And then in 1 Timothy, he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. And then when he gives his explanation, he doesn't say something like, because God spoke words of judgment over the woman, he speaks to the situation that pertains to the creation of the man and the woman prior to the entrance of sin into the world. And so I think that establishes these hierarchies in relationships as aspects of the pre-fall created order. And I think Paul is basing his argument on that.
Maybe just to say one thing about this as well. I think the Achilles heel of this argument is that the same Paul who gives these people a hermeneutic for saying in Christ everything's equal is the same Paul who says man should have that authority over women. Like he himself doesn't pull this hermeneutic through. Why should we? What should we think Paul's thoughts better than him? It's just that I think that's the big Achilles heel of this argument.
So I have a question for Kevin. You described the depth of the story of Absalom and of Song of Songs, and how the bigger picture shows a whole different storyline than you could see at first. My question is, how important, or what is the importance of the zoomed in story before you look at, or after you look at the big picture?
The big picture is what helps inform that zoom in story. So if you go back to the illustration of sort of having your nose right up to the painting, it's very difficult to tell what you're looking at until you back up and read it in light of its whole. Now I can actually see that detail for what it is, zoomed up. And hopefully, in some ways like I did yesterday in Exodus 4, is there's a lot of zoom up commentary in terms of what's happening with Moses and his excuses going on there. But in the larger picture, God is sending him as a deliverer of his people. And so ultimately where we get with Moses' excuses is that when God delivers his people, it's clearly not because of Moses. It's because God has done this. So all those excuses, the zoomed up story, those are important because they're actually highlighting Moses' weaknesses and inability to do this, so to speak. And yet God gets to answer each one of those excuses zoomed up in ways that declare his self-sufficiency so that we can know ultimately when Moses delivers, it's God who's delivering. Does that help? Yeah.
Last question, you.
I was wondering after, it's the second time I've heard this idea that, I think it was you, Kevin, when you understand the way that the Old Testament is organized in the Masoretic text, I guess, in the Tanakh, where or the Book of Chronicles is at the end of the Old Testament, how important of a role does it play reading the Old Testament in that order? And whether there's English editions, or I suppose the Masoretic text is ordered like that, that one could use to read the Bible, especially the Old Testament, in that order, to come to insights about patterns and types and so on. So what role does that play, if any, and if there's resources to do that?
Somebody's publishing an English translation with the Old Testament in the Tanakh order. I can't remember who it is.
Robert Alter.
So Robert Alter, his translation of the Old Testament, but there's also a major translation. CSB, yeah, okay. So Broadman and Holman is putting out a copy of the CSB with the books in the Tanakh order, Law, Prophets, and Writings.
Should we do that?
I beg your pardon? Should we do that? I have pled with Crossway that they do that. I've begged them to do that. And they have taken it to their publishing committee and they have discussed it, and I think they've decided they don't want to go to the trouble. They don't think it's worth the money. They don't think they'll make enough money. So they've decided not to do it. Either that or it's just not something that Lane Dennis, maybe for personal reasons, wants to do. I don't know. I wasn't in the meetings. All I know is they said, we're not going to do that right now. But I think, my view, not everybody agrees with me, my view is that Luke 24 indicates that Jesus mentally organized the books of the Old Testament in this way. And my question is, if we're followers of Jesus, don't we want to think about the Old Testament the way that he did? And why would we want to think about it some other way? And if he is assuming this order in Luke 24 and in the statement about the blood of all the martyrs from Abel to Zechariah, it would seem that this order would help us to understand things that he says. So why would we want to invent an order around the time of the printing press that then becomes normative because it gets, incorporated at that time with all the new Bibles that are being published? In other words, this order has no foundation in antiquity. It's not the order that you find in the Greek translations of the Old Testament. Those codices that contain the entirety of the Old Testament in Greek put the books in a different order from the one that's in our English translations. So why would we want to follow this order? Well, because it makes logical sense to Western people. I don't think that's a very good answer. Or because all of our publishers have already assumed this order and all the indexes of our books are this way and all of our Bible software is assuming this order. Again, that's just convenience for us. I don't think that really helps us understand the scriptures.